How are you doing, you wonderful nerds? Scott here, and I am still away from my family emergency, which means we are still doing some great guest spots here on the channel. Today we have Owen from Owen Likes Comics talking about a little hiccup in the MCU timeline that Spider-Man Homecoming accidentally introduced. Take it away, Owen.
Spider-Man Homecoming was finally released worldwide last week to a huge critical and commercial success, giving many fans what they've anxiously waited for a decade, a live-action Spider-Man film set within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. When it was announced early last year that Marvel and Sony had struck a deal to bring the web-slinger over to the MCU, many were sceptical about how seamless this process would actually be, integrating one of the most well-known superheroes in the world into this already existing universe. Thankfully, in both Civil War and Homecoming, Marvel have created a Spider-Man who not only feels at home within the MCU, but does so without sacrificing any of the beloved elements of the character. However, while Homecoming is definitely a fantastic addition to the MCU, there could be a massive continuity error within the film that could have serious ramifications for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So if you've seen Homecoming by now, you'll remember the film's opening sequence depicting Adrian Toomes running a cleanup operation in New York after the Chitauri invasion from the first Avengers movie, before he's screwed out of the contract by damage control and seeks revenge against Tony Stark. Now, after this prelude, we get an 8 years later timestamp before catching up with Peter Parker, following off from the events of Captain America Civil War. So this means that Homecoming is set 8 years following the Avengers, and while this at face value doesn't seem like too much of an issue, it actually could confuse the MCU timeline quite a lot. You see, the MCU timeline is overly complicated to try and explain because Marvel have tried to maintain that their films are set in real time, i.e. the time in which they are released in theatres, and as a result this creates something of a headache. If Homecoming is set 8 years after the Avengers, then it means both itself and Civil War are either set in the year 2020, or that Homecoming is set now in 2017, and therefore the Avengers actually occurred closer to 2009. While we are able to safely plot down a few key dates, drawing an overall timeline of the MCU is incredibly difficult. For instance, we can say that Iron Man is set in the year that it was released, 2008, thanks to a Mad Money episode briefly shown, which just happens to be dated 2008. Furthermore, it's also revealed that Tony Stark's birthday is May 29th, and he celebrates his birthday in Iron Man 2 by racing in the Monaco Grand Prix. In real life, the 2009 Monaco Grand Prix was held on May 24th, only a few days prior to Tony's birthday. Around this time, the events of both Thor and The Incredible Hulk take place also. In the Avengers prequel comic Fury's Big Week, we get a little more clarification about this, seeing Nick Fury and S.H.I.E.L.D's response to several key events which all occurred at this time, such as the Stark Expo explosion from Iron Man 2, Hulk's battle with the Abomination in Harlem, and the destruction of a New Mexico town from Thor, meaning that all of these events occur in the summer of 2009. And as a result, it's safe to assume that the Avengers takes place sometime during 2010, as Fury mentions that it's been a year since the event of Thor. So this means that if Avengers is set in 2010, and therefore Homecoming takes place 8 years later in 2018, that settles it, right? While it is somewhat feasible that Homecoming takes place in 2018, this theory begins to fail when you take into account that it takes place months following Captain America Civil War. In Civil War, the Vision references Stark being Iron Man for 8 years, meaning that with Iron Man being set in 2008, Civil War was also likely set in the year that it was made, 2016, and with Homecoming very much dealing with Peter's life months following Civil War, must also take place around this time. See, the problem is that because Marvel Studios has been so vague on assigning exact years to most of their films despite attempting to follow a real-time chronology that corresponds to their releases, trying to connect the events into a linear map becomes difficult. However, there is another explanation for this and can be found throughout the history of Marvel Comics dating back to the early 1960s. The Marvel Universe as we know it today was first published within Fantastic Four #1 in 1961, with all of the characters and stories introduced prior, i.e. Captain America and Namor. Retcons would have occurred earlier on in this universe, and for the first handful of years, Marvel's stories operated in real time, with the stories set in the present years that the comics were printed. However, this soon became an issue when characters with age-defined backgrounds such as Peter Parker were introduced. You see, Peter was a sophomore in high school when he gained his powers in 1962, and because Marvel was still publishing in real time, graduated from high school in 1965. Had Marvel continued at this rate, all of the characters would age out of their roles eventually, creating a huge headache for the writers. As a result, they adopted a metric known as Marvel Time. This, also known as a sliding time scale, saw Marvel begin to slow down time within their universe, causing the characters to age much slower. For instance, Peter Parker started as a freshman in college in Amazing Spider-Man 31 of 1965 and spent 4 in-universe years in college until he graduated in Amazing Spider-Man 185 of 1978. In short, the idea is that each story takes place as it's being read, with the history of the book happening a while ago or a few years ago. Everything since the Fantastic Four first debuted has happened in a near 15-year period, just without clear markers on the years that particular stories took place in, only that they were published prior to the current story. It could be that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has quietly adopted a sliding timescale, and that each film release does indeed take place now. But as they do, the events of previous films get pushed back a little further, and this could explain how Homecoming takes place now in 2017. It's because the events of the Avengers and the earlier films have been subtly pushed back a couple of years. It's possible that the retcon for the 8-year gap is more so to match Peter's age with that of his recently retconned cameo in Iron Man 2. If Iron Man 2 is set in 2009 and Homecoming in late 2016, it gives Marvel a 7-year time difference to work with, allowing Peter to be a freshman like he is in the film, without it causing a larger continuity issue. Furthermore, it's not necessarily unheard of either that Marvel would attempt to play loose with the canon. In fact, Kevin Feige, during an interview with Cinema Blend, discussed why the Marvel films don't overlap in time anymore like they did in Phase 1, stating that, "I think people like to talk about our long-term plans, which we certainly have, but very rarely do these long-term plans dictate the specificity of any individual film. It's usually the opposite. It's focusing on a story and focusing on the individual movie that we're making to do what's best. And then if something changes that we weren't quite expecting down the line because it was made for a better movie, then we'll deal with it down the line." And I think Feige's statement encapsulates the entire issue. While it's true that not every date in the MCU timeline perfectly adds up, is that not to be expected to happen eventually? In such an interconnected cinematic universe, spanning multiple franchises with multiple different writers and directors, all seeking to make their film. While these inconsistencies will occasionally irritate us, it'd be difficult to say that they seriously impact our viewing experience. And as Feige alludes to, if continuity prevents the best possible film from being made, then maybe it's best to focus on the individual movie and deal with any repercussions at a later date. In short, while the 8 years later setting of Homecoming from Avengers doesn't perfectly line up with the timeline, it appears that Marvel isn't too worried. So why should we be? Marvel's ability to create a flexible continuity in a way which subconsciously adapts the nuanced details of previous films in order to fit their vision is something smart and gives both the filmmakers and the overall universe a little time on their side.
Thank you so much for filling in, Owen. Definitely go check out his channel. Link will be in the description down below, right under that big sexy subscribe button, which you can hit along with the notification bell to make sure you don't miss the next video's guest spot. It's going to be a fun one. And of course, thank you to all of our patrons who make these videos possible, especially Christopher Lang, Patrick Cattery, Austin Rogers, Mike Harville, Kendra, Elizabeth Monsell, and of course, the rest of the wonderful nerds over at patreon.com/NerdSync. And make sure you click or tap right here for some great hand-picked videos that YouTube thinks you will definitely enjoy. I don't know what you'll enjoy, but the algorithm does, and at the end of the day, isn't that a little scary? Anyway, until the next video, my name is Scott, reminding you to read between the panels and grow smarter through comics. See ya.